I've been asked to introduce our esteemed Phil Schultz, a great poet. I want to say as way of introduction that Phil is a Pulitzer Prize-winning poet, Fulbright, Guggenheim, NIFA, NEA Fellowship awardee. He comes to us tonight fully loaded. And he's the founder as well of an amazing private school called the Writer Studio, which has been since, 1987, 86, 7? 87, been teaching the craft, the skill, the genius of both, long form and short form poetry and fictions, et cetera, et cetera. His collection of poetry always have upbeat titles, like Deep Within the Ravine, The Holy Worm of Praise, Failure, and most recently, The Comforts of the Abyss. His poetry does not shed light on the struggles to be alive, to be real, and to be present, but instead finds the light within that. And he sees it deeply, and he sees it clearly, and he sees what it is to be a life. So we're fortunate for him to be here. We're fortunate to call him a neighbor. Please welcome Phil Schultz. This is for you. Do you want to stand? Huh?
No,
that's for me?
Yeah. Well, I'm going to be reading from my most recent, it's a memoir, Comforts of the Abyss. And I knew it wasn't uplifting, but well, this is the theme of boxing. I met Norman Mailer in 1972. I was between teaching jobs and trying to live in P-Town, Provincetown, Mass. And I had a landlord who also owned a restaurant across the street, and he knew I was penurious. That's a word that Norman used, and I asked him what that meant, and he thought that was funny, because I had to be kidding, but I wasn't. And my landlord, Cyril, introduced me to Norman, thinking that I was going through a rough time, and that this would cheer me up. And and we became friends. It was interesting. We became friends and would take walks together. And then I moved to Cambridge, and he was in Stockbridge, and I would go and visit him. So this is the section where that happens. It was around this time that he began inviting me up to Stockbridge, where he lived with Carol and their daughter Maggie, and on my first trip there, Mary Oliver and Molly Cook arranged for me to drive two of Mailer's young sons, Michael and Stephen, from his previous and fourth marriage with Beverly Bentley, up to Stockbridge, where I had no sooner gotten out of the car than Norman put boxing gloves on me and said, "Let's see what you have, hombre." Very casual. Ominous words. Kids in my old neighborhood slugged at each other, and with and without gloves. Who could afford boxing gloves? Mostly flailing our arms about and shouting insults at each other, while only occasionally landing a punch. But Norman wanted a sparring partner, and that's what I became. He was a good teacher, patient and interested in what he saw as an art form, while I enjoyed using all my old street game tricks, Feinting and twirling to the side to avoid his mostly playful swings meant more as instruction than landing punches or making points. But when a woman was even in the vicinity of his backyard where we sparred, he'd suddenly become someone else altogether. Not exactly a Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde transformation, because in his case, the change didn't appear to be entirely voluntary or conscious. He must have assumed I could handle being hit in the body or face, or he probably never would have put gloves on me in the first place, though mostly we danced around in a kind of pedagogical trance, gossiping about the inanities of various other contemporary fiction writers, while Norman showed off his rather sophisticated knowledge of the art of fisticuffs. But the first time his wife Carol stopped to say hello to me, and I turned my head to reply, I found myself lying flat on my back, having water splashed in my face. And there was Norman on his knees next to me, pounding the earth with his gloved hand, cursing himself. I was too groggy to even attempt to comfort him, if that's what he wanted, though it soon became clear that his capacity for guilt was nearly as great as his appetite for just about everything else, especially women. He was married 6 times and sired 8 kids, adopting a 9th. Okay, I'm going to skip ahead. This section is called Indian Wrestling. Though I always assumed it was my version of his own recklessness, the street kid who made up dangerous games and ignored the fateful consequences that attracted Norman to me, it eventually became clear that despite his appreciation for what he deemed my fearlessness, the sensitive and perhaps vulnerable poet in him also sought companionship, an attraction he would no doubt find difficult to admit to. These qualities, which he appreciated in others, didn't somehow fit into the comforting image he had created for himself, that of a powerful man who would never back down from a fight, even, maybe especially, one he himself cultivated. It was the same image Hemingway found comfort in, that of the gladiator and matador, an image that to some degree belied the very element of their natures that wrote their most influential and, yes, beautiful work, their sensitivity. In other words, the poet in them. Hemingway's best work is his most powerfully felt, where the language becomes a thing unto itself, not a means to an end, not evidence of his intelligence or force of will, but an evocation of his love of the very process in which he was conveying everything he believed worthy of his undiluted attention, his passion for language. His inimitable lyricism is his openness, his embrace of the world at its most beautiful and ugly. War and love and cowardice and honor were not only ideas, but ideals and sources of inspiration. And his keen sensitivity to language, his romance with the intimacy of his perceptions, not only conveyed this passion, it was also its source. And yet Hemingway and Norman and so many other male writers of their time, and perhaps even ours, saw their sensitivity as unmanly, because they saw the kind of delicate, nuanced, detailed sympathy required to write on this level as being feminine in nature. They couldn't acknowledge to themselves or others the very means or qualities of their originality, and chose to align themselves with their more primitive instincts. In other words, they're shitbirds. Shitbirds are self-depreciating aspects of every person, every artist. Their shitbirds despise their very source of inspiration and created personas that use self-loathing, booze, drugs, and a rejection of intimacy as weapons against what was quintessentially the poet in themselves. We once had a conversation that almost amounted to that, which he didn't disagree with. Another example of this kind of sabotage, and I guess you could say that when you're at war with yourself, and there's a painting upstairs where the man is fighting his own doppelganger, his own image, that is a kind of self-sabotage. Another example of this kind of sabotage is the night Norman set up an Indian wrestling contest between me and Jose Torres, the light heavyweight boxing champion of the world. I like to say I'm kidding, but no, it happened. I always possessed a good sense of balance. It wasn't easy to knock me down at any street game, and I once scored high in a state contest for being able to lift my body off the ground by balancing my weight on my hands, my knees resting on my elbows, for several long, agonizing minutes. Sounds painful, doesn't it? This ability made me good at all kinds of sports, though Indian wrestling was something I excelled at through college. If I wanted to feel good about myself, I would challenge someone much bigger than me to a bout, and then strut about like a peacock. In my freshman year at the University of Louisville, I helped pay my tuition by writing papers for the football team, the Division I Cardinals, that played and sometimes won titles in the NCAA Atlantic Coast Conference. I lived on the same dorm floor and would charge $5 for an A, $3 for a B+, and $1 for a C in any subject, knowing if I and they did well, I'd get a nice tip. My writing was good enough to impress even or maybe especially when I didn't have any idea what I was writing about, which meant just about every subject except for English. I'm still going to put you through something here. The players, all twice my size, not only didn't mind paying me, but they also kind of adopted me as their mascot. If anyone looked askance at me, they would have what they called a little talk with them. Yes, the football team was my personal squad of bodyguards, and I would sometimes eat with them in the cafeteria, all of which lasted until one of the coaches began to inquire what their fascination with me was all about. For a while, it was heaven, and to enlarge their regard, I would challenge one or two to a contest of Indian wrestling, contest that for the most part I won. Their size was my advantage. They had no idea what I was doing to win, but loved the idea that someone my size, who was smart, could beat them at anything that required physical prowess. None of them ever caught on that my only trick was to use their weight and confidence against them, which served me well with Norman Mailer, too, who never stopped trying to beat me. Just once. It's a contest primarily of balance in which the contestants face each other, planting their front foot side by side, and after bracing their back leg and foot behind them for balance, lock right hands and then try to force their opponent to move his back foot off the ground. Beating Norman wasn't all that hard. He was strong, very strong, but I knew how to shift my weight and outmaneuver him, and to some degree use his own stubborn determination against him. And then one Saturday night, after I had driven up to Stockbridge from Cambridge with a lady friend to a big 4th of July party he was throwing, he came looking for me as soon as we parked in front of his house to say he already challenged a friend of his to one of my leg wrestling matches, that it should be great fun. You know how this turns out, right? The idea sounded terrible, like a public spectacle I wanted no part of. But Norman was insistent. His friend was outside on the patio, and there were a lot of well-known boxing friends there, like Don King, and he wanted to, well, show me off. What he didn't say was that they were already betting, and he had put $100 on me. The woman I brought was a feminist academic I had met at the MacDowell Colony retreat that summer and who wanted to come even though I warned her about the kind of macho atmosphere she'd find there. She was intrigued perhaps in a way an anthropologist might be in visiting a primitive civilization she had only read about in books. Norman had never before greeted me with this kind of enthusiasm, so I knew something was up. And I reluctantly followed him through the house onto the backyard patio, where I suddenly found myself being introduced to Jose Torres, the light heavyweight champion of the world. I had actually met him before at Norman's Brooklyn Heights pad, and found him to be an extremely warm and funny man, a Puerto Rican whose peekaboo style of boxing was something he himself often displayed for fun, and had once tried to show me how to position myself in, with my body bent to the side and both raised fists covering my face. But the man I was now facing, dressed in a bright blue sports jacket and black pants, didn't look at all warm or funny. He was pouting, in fact, looking me over and pouting. Who did this little shit that Norman was bragging so much about think he was? Is what I guessed this expression meant. Then he smiled, handed his glass to someone standing next to him, and in an accent I struggled to understand, said, "So you're the tough guy who can't be beat, huh?" The woman I was with whispered in my ear, "Let's get out of here this minute, really." The fact that all this is true, I don't know how to feel about it. We now seem to be standing in the middle of an impromptu boxing ring of glaring faces, many angling to get a better look. Norman, who had been standing next to me a moment ago, was suddenly nowhere to be seen, while Jose continued to glare at me. Well, I told myself, it's only a game of leg wrestling. What could I lose, a little dignity? He was powerfully built, only a little taller, but a lot heavier and all muscle. I knew I couldn't move him an inch, no matter how agile I was. And now, with everyone so eager to see what they probably assumed would be a massacre, I just wanted to get it over with. If I survived, I would let Norman know what I thought of all this and maybe never see him again. And then Norman was next to me, whispering something in my ear I couldn't make out, and yanking at my arm. Before I knew what was happening, I was being pulled through the crowd and into the house, my lady friend, looking relieved, hurrying to keep up with us. Inside the dining room, in a pantry, he hurriedly explained that a friend of Jose's mistress had been killed in a car accident in Puerto Rico earlier that day, and he was in no mood to get beaten at anything. A mutual friend had just pulled Norman aside and told him, he said, "You beat him, and I think you will, and he'll probably kill you." I guess he expected me to comfort him again. It's all my fault. I had no idea, just thought it'd be fun. He's always such a sweetheart, really. I was ordered to go upstairs to the attic room to hide while he would try to come up. My feelings exactly. While he would try to come up with some excuse. It was where we would spend the night anyway, he added. But we couldn't come back down until we heard from him. I shouldn't worry, he would take care of things. All I could think to say was that we hadn't eaten yet and were hungry. He and my lady friend both looked at me as if I was a madman. He was busy trying to save my life, and I was worrying about eating. Frightened and confused, we spent a good part of the rest of the evening in hiding. I never would have beaten him, I told myself, so there was nothing to worry about, and I should be flattered that Norman held me in such high regard. Yes, flattered and relieved, I told myself, knowing I had avoided what could have been a fateful confrontation. But of course, my shitbird got the last word. Now everyone knew what a phony and coward I was, first bragging about being unbeatable and then running off to hide. The fact that I did neither didn't seem to matter. Only the poet and fiction writer in me remained silent, perhaps too confused finally to even have an opinion. I'm going to end with a poem I wrote that was inspired by Eric's painting. The painting is called Broken Hallelujah, after Eric Fischl. Let me say that I started out as a poet, mostly being inspired by a painting by Arshil Gorky called The Artist and His Mother. And most people here probably know of it. It's a painting that Gorky took 10 years. He lost it. His mother died of starvation in the Armenian genocide. And when he first came here, he and his sister survived and came here. And he spent 10 years of his life doing this painting, trying to get it right, trying to recreate her. And she fed them her food. So it was a powerful painting, and it became the cover of my first book. I haven't been as taken with a painting since. I mean, I love painting, and I look at them all the time, but I do love Eric's painting. And I guess this poem addresses why. Broken Hallelujah. Here he is, the artist as combatant, alone inside the darkness of his arena. His eyes staring at us, scalding our imaginations, daring us to enter the fever of revelation, the violence of vision. His hands anointed red, resting between rounds of agony and satisfaction, waiting for the exaltation to begin again. The blackness of his clothes erupting in anger, sweeping us ever deeper into the oblivion of inspiration, the unforeseen. Beside him, tumbling woman struggling to take flight, rise above being calamity's mistress, the ransom of history. The tools, easels, paper, towels, color, canvas imploding into the nakedness of adoration. April in Paris, a fire and light. Another woman standing behind him, swallowing her testimony, staring at the man imprisoned inside her story. Yes, paintings inside paintings, the formulas of passion, bloodied but unbroken, stretched across millenniums of crawling forever deeper into jubilation, the mortal rendered visible, vulnerable. Yes, there, hidden inside his glaze, us, pleading for meaning, to be understood, forgiven, for wanting to be saved. Yes, Lord, saved. Thank you.
My dislike thing? Yeah. A little bit. Why?
Thank you so much, Phil. That was really poignant and really lovely, so thank you so much. And I'd like to just start off by saying the three of us up here on the dais are actually all dyslexic. So it's, I want to start off by asking a very personal question of both of you, and I'll give my answer, which is, how old were you when you learned to read? I learned to read when I was 8 years old.
I still haven't learned. What is reading? No, I don't remember. I went through the school system where you learn supposedly how to read, but I struggled to be able to sustain whatever length of It was because it was never like somebody said, "Oh, you must be dyslexic." It was more like, "What the fuck is the matter with you?"
I was 11, and I had been held back twice, and I guess I was in the 5th grade, yeah. And I didn't find out until my son was diagnosed with it in 2nd grade, and I was 58.
So that leads to my next question, which is, what is the place of struggle in your youth, and also overcoming those questions and difficulties? How do you think that has affected you as mature artists?
You want me to go first? Yeah.
Whichever.
Please.
Well, I went through the school system without taking art classes or being really exposed to the other ways of organizing information, and it was something that actually, it wasn't until I enrolled in an art class when I was 20 years old that I found 2 things I didn't actually know I was looking for, but were such a revelation to me. One was, making things. And with these silly little problems they would give students at this art, beginning art class. It was the first time I could concentrate. And I could concentrate for hours, sitting there. What I made, what didn't seem to matter. I mean, they'd say pour, plaster into a milk cart and take it apart, carve something. And I'd spend hours carving something that ended up with just being a nose. Whatever. But the other thing I found, which was even more important, was it was the first time I was not afraid to be alone. And I realized that, those 2 things made me feel so integrated. That it no longer mattered, except that in terms of trying to figure out who I was, what I found out was who I was. I just had to get better at it, and so that's what propelled me along in the art world, or the practice of art, anyway.
Well, I just realized something that I don't think I ever really connected to before. I drew all the time. My first love was painting. I wanted to be a painter. I was so taken with Van Gogh's self-portraits that I stole a book from Sibley's department store, and my father was called down. I had a choice.
You actually got caught?
I got caught, and I had a choice between my father and the police, and I chose the police. This is why Mailer didn't scare me. And my father, in driving me home, actually wanted to understand why I wanted that book so much. And there was something about what he was showing in that expression, Van Gogh, in the self-portraits, is what got me. That I felt spoke to me. And it's very nice. The next morning, instead of giving me a hard time, I found the book on the kitchen table. My father went back and bought it.
Nice.
And I grew up in school. I was in a dummy class. I mean, they didn't think we could be taught. So I poured myself into drawing. I was a school cartoonist, and that was my passion. And I had a tutor who was attempting to teach me how to read, and he once asked me, out of frustration because he wasn't getting anywhere, what are you going to do in life? If you understand, you won't be able to read buses. You won't be able to read. What do you want to do in life? And I think just probably to piss him off, I said I want to be a writer. And that was the first time the idea occurred to me. He, of course, laughed and loved that. But it did affect me. I think maybe I'm still trying to piss him off.
Are you going to tell your story?
Oh. Sure. I mean,
this is like strip poker.
The headmistress told my parents that I was very nice and I would make a professional man a very good wife, but I would never. I would be lucky if I finished school. But the funniest thing, my sort of moment, was in French class. I was writing something, and my teacher said, yes, that's actually grammatically correct, but it's very poetic, and it's not how you would write it, and so it's wrong. And I remember thinking, hell mend it. I will go and live in France, and I will write in French. And I ended up writing my master's and another degree beyond my master's in French at a French university, and spent 8 years in Paris. All thanks to a terrible woman called Miss McGowan, who also taught me to knit. Terrible, terrible woman.
And let me say that
we happen to have her here tonight.
dyslexics have the worst time in the world learning language. I mean, that left part of the brain just can't do it. I could never. I failed Latin twice. So the fact that you accomplish that against all odds is remarkable.
And I think that that is one of the really interesting things. I'm an art historian. I am not somebody who creates art. I study art, and I'm very aware of that difference. But it does seem to me that there is a need for a single focus, and there is a need for, to a certain degree, a selfishness or perhaps a devotion to one's craft. When did you both come to the point where you realized that devotion to the craft of writing and to painting was going to take over your lives?
I've actually never thought about it in that way, but as you were speaking, I was thinking, I started, as I got better at the craft, I started to lose friends. That my friends that were artists, we were all in the same classes, et cetera, and there were points at which my drive began to exceed theirs. My clarity of focus, my time spent, et cetera, and they began to sort of distance themselves. And I think, it wasn't like a dramatic moment, a decision along those lines, but it was something where, the more I committed, the farther along I got in it, et cetera, the more I noticed that I was, where the hell are they? Nobody calls, nobody writes.
Well, that's a great question, a very difficult one. I think that so much of it, the way I felt, worked against me. There was a great deal of feelings of disappointment and that I wasn't going to do what I could. I was so used to feeling that way that I wanted to use emotion. I wanted to befriend that emotion instead of it attacking me. And I think that art and that writing a lot gave me that. There was something about that I didn't worry about what other people would make of it. I didn't worry about, I couldn't be tested in the regular way. I tested poorly. But I could create an imaginative world where I would grade myself in satisfaction, in feeling, that I was worthwhile. So I created, I think, a course, a path, and I followed that path, and I didn't look back. It wasn't conscious.
So I'm going to open it up for questions, just one or two questions. But before we do, I have one last question for both of you, because something else you both share is life partners who are also artists. And so you are both in these incredible creative sort of small communities, marriages. Can you say something about that? I'm obviously not prodding for something specific, but I mean, how is it to live with a creative partner?
It's swell.
I asked for that. I apologize.
Well, I wanted to hear Phil because his wife's sitting right there looking at him. At least April's not in here, so.
I've had some experience with, but never anything like this. I love it.
Could you, microphone?
Oh, when I found out that Monica was an artist, I just loved it. Not only is there a sympathy and an understanding that's built in, but there's a sense of identification. And as I tried to say before, all that I wanted art, I loved art, but I, for whatever reason, didn't pursue that. But in a way, this compliment I feel in watching her go about this evolution, this learning and struggling and this combat with the vision. It's satisfying on a level that I could never have imagined. And thank you for asking that.
Questions from the audience?
Oh, sure. Thank you. Well, thank you to all of you. It was a wonderful evening. Philip, special thanks to you. Your words are so inspiring. I have strong feelings. I apologize. But I edited a book, a psychoanalytic book on failure. It won't surprise you that on the cover is Van Gogh's self-portrait, followed by Van Gogh.
Van Gogh's self-portrait on the cover of Failure.
Followed by Van Gogh is the quotation from your poetry on failure. Then I said something about, I hope you don't mind me mentioning this, but in the spirit of strip poker, you reported in that book being in a psychiatric ward. So I'm a psychologist. You don't have to answer this. Say, shut up, Rebecca. This is not anything I want to discuss, but I'm curious how you evolved and became such a happy person.
Thank you so much.
When I was, I guess, what was it, 20, and I was in San Francisco, and I was living in a room taking care of 2 kids, and I was going through a hard time, and I got a Dear John letter from a girl I loved back home in Rochester. And a therapist at school told me that there was a clinic that I could talk to someone if I felt I needed to. And unfortunately, the bus system in San Francisco was, as you can imagine, convoluted. And I told the bus driver where I wanted to go, and he took me to a place called the Psych Ward, which is like a Rikers Island, where it was a holding facility where they put people, criminals, everything, but they didn't know what to do with them. People awaiting trial. So that's how I got there, thinking I was going to see a therapist, and I was there for, I think, overnight.
What happened after that? You were obviously cured.
I was scared shitless. I saw what the real careerists were up to. And there was one guy who came up to me as soon as I was admitted there and said, I'm a psychosexual, what are you? I had no idea what a psychosexual was, but and I, of course, didn't have a phone in those days. This is in the 60s, so I couldn't look it up. I said, ditto. He wanted to become friendlier than I wanted to be. But thank you very much for that. It's a very,
So we have another question?
Very,
There's
Thank you.
Hi, how do you move on from being creatively stuck?
That's a great question.
I actually did a book years ago where I asked, I think it turned out to be 60 artists, 3 generations of artists, if they could give me a problem that they would give to a young artist or an art student or something like that. The book's called A Sketchbook with Voices. But what I found was by asking them directly, they had nothing to give. You know, they didn't, I don't know, I don't teach, I don't know what to tell anybody, you know, blah, blah, blah. But if I got them to talk about their work, they would come up with these incredible ways of solving problems. And a lot of them had surrounded this thing of being stuck, what do you do? And some of my favorite ones were Richard Archwager was overworking a painting. And so he decided, his studio was right next to his living room, separated by a wall and a door. So he decided that he would watch TV all day long in his living room and only go into his studio during commercials to paint. Figuring that if he only had 2 minutes or 5 minutes, whatever, he would get past it, and of course he did, right? Another artist, a sculptor, would take a lump of clay, and behind his back, so he couldn't see what he was doing, he would make something with his hands, trying to feel his way into it being something that would interest him. And at a certain point, he would think, yeah, this feels interesting. He'd take it out, look at it, and then put it on a shelf and go back and do another one and another one until at some point he also moved into a place where he could, you know, get back more focused to what he was doing. So In other words, I think every artist has different ways of handling stuckness, and they all have to do with playing games with yourself. And out of that play, usually why you're stuck is you've just bored the shit out of yourself. And so you need to, and it's not like you can just say stop being boring. You actually have to find excitement again, and game playing is a great way to do it. So.
What's the question again? I mean, what was
The question is, how do you deal when you get stuck? As an artist, what do you do when you get stuck?
I write another draft. I mean, I write endless drafts. If you might think that poem is done.
Well, Monica assured me it wasn't. So.
I mean, you've already seen several.
Yeah.
I constantly do it over again, and it's like, I guess it's what I've done with my personality.
That would lead to the obvious question of how do you know when the poem is done? Because that's sort of the flip side of what she was asking.
Well, there's this French poet who said that we don't finish poems, we abandon them. Oh. And I guess there's a point at which I can't stand it anymore. And it can't stand me. And it's the feeling of resentment is mutual. But I do take an idea to a point where I can't do anything else with it, where it's just doesn't want to cooperate anymore, and it's either you toss it or you concede that it's done.
No.
Other questions? Barbara?
Thank you so much for your sharing your journeys. You mentioned, and this may be a little bit too direct a question to each of you, but I love your story, Eric, that you've shared in the past about that moment of realization that, oh, I could be an artist. Mm-hmm. And you once shared a story about a guy who was fixing a mower with you or something, and he said, come in and try this, and you thought, oh, I can't do that. But you each mentioned that moment in your genesis and your journey where you realized you could be alone, and you've chosen very lonesome paths to take. Do you remember that moment where you said, oh, now I feel free from being alone, that I've become the person that I want to be, that you're calmer, that you are more at peace at that moment?
I don't think it was one moment. I think it was, for me, a progression. The person that you were referring to actually wasn't fixing a motor. He was. We worked at a furniture store in Phoenix, a lawn furniture store. He put them together, and I delivered them. And he was more or less my age, and he worked part-time because the other part he went to Phoenix Community College and took art classes. And we got to be friends, and we got to talk and stuff like that. And he was, the art that he was making was along the lines of gluing pieces of bread to window panes. And so we would argue about why that's not art, and he would argue why that is art. And it kind of went back and forth. And he obviously I had a very narrow sense of art, and it involved people like Rembrandt and stuff, and bread on window panes wasn't part of it, and whatnot. But I would find myself hanging out at his house, and he'd be working on something, and I'd just be watching. We'd get stoned, and I'd be watching him, and then I'd say, why don't you do that? And he goes, why don't you do it? No, I can't do it. I'm not an artist. And then he'd watch him a little bit more. How about if you did that? No, why don't you do, et cetera. And at some point, it just became clear that if he can glue bread to window panes, I could find other things to glue bread to.
And you were how old then?
I was 20. Yeah, I had already gone and flunked out of college once and went off to be a hippie and things like that. And then when I, sort of wore that out, I came back home to kind of clean up and stuff and drove my father crazy. And he kept saying, go get a fucking job, get a job, just anything. And so I got this job. And then when he heard I just signed up for art classes, that was the end of it. Anyway.
It's a great story.
Yeah.
Phil, did you have a response you wanted to add?
What was the question again?
When did you feel free?
Was there a moment when I realized that I was a writer? Alone.
A lonely writer.
I like that, being alone. It always allowed to, one of my favorite people is, my wife knows this only too well, I talk to myself. And we have riveting conversations. See? You thought I was talking to you. No, I think there's something about, being in your own head, your own heart, where it makes a kind of sense, and if the things around you don't make sense, then you recede to that. It's a point of safety, and it allows you to think your way through things, and it becomes a form of creation.
I have a question.
Sherry.
Yes, thank you. It might be the final question, but this is for all three of you, and importantly, it's also for you, Sara. And I'm not going to accept the answer that you're not an artist, because in many ways you are a very expansive thinker who becomes obsessively focused on specific pursuits, and in that way, the way you think is much more like an artist than many other people. We work together, that's how I know this. It's not completely psychic or anything. So the question is almost full circle, because you started on the question for all of you was about defeat or failure, or the earliest beginnings coming from a place where you were characterized by something that was a losing gambit, right? But ostensibly, I think what we all know is that all three of you are sitting here because you're remarkably successful. And for any person who starts off on the pursuit that you guys started off on, very few of them wind up in a position where they've made a full livelihood, let alone a public platform. And I think that might be surprising. I guess that's what my question is. What does that feel like? Is it surprising for you? And I thought of this upstairs when Eric was describing some of the genesis of the show conceptually, and he admitted to being in a place of defeat and frustration, and I heard people laugh. Did you notice that?
I was crying, so I didn't.
And I thought, you're on the inside of something. Do you still identify with this kid who's a dyslexic ne'er-do-well? Or do you own the fact that you are now, to use the boxing metaphor, you won the match. You did the TKO, all three of you.
I think it's an overused word, but I think that early trauma of, I can't speak for you two. I knew I was bright. I couldn't understand why I couldn't compete in class. And my brother used to he used to make fun of me because I couldn't read, and I was given a big book of fairy tales, but it was very well illustrated, so I used to recount the stories to myself to show my brother that I was reading, and of course I wasn't. I was just following along with the images. So I think you never lose that sense of that the struggle. But from a very early age, I was convinced I was a tank. I was convinced that there was nothing that could stop me, and that I really did feel physically. I could take it and I would keep going. So, very personal.
Yeah, no, very good. I don't know how to answer the question in terms of, the struggle to be the artist that you're compelled to be, as well as the success that either does or doesn't come along with that, right? And I know in terms of my experience with continually moving forward, going, deeper and deeper into what became a career as an artist, I had angels along the way, and I define the angels as those who saw something in me before I could see it in me, and sort of bet on me in that way, and actually created opportunities, and those opportunities were things that I took, even though I hadn't planned it out or whatever, and that led me into an ever-expanding sort of sense of what this thing is that I do. In terms of how you measure success in relationship to career, that's very different. I mean, as artists, we're all in our studios trying to figure out what makes sense to you in the moment that you're in, and we're all. It would be interesting to hear if Phil agreed with this, but that I never knew what I was thinking, feeling, until I could see it. It wasn't something I could, think my way through or wrap my head around per se. I literally come to the end of a painting with so that's what it's about, kind of thing. And again, that's something where you would measure success based on finding that moment of, that is it, right? That, which again is different than the career that you're also dealing with in terms of trying to push that farther and farther out into the world, try to find an audience receptive to what you're picturing or struggling to define, name, et cetera, et cetera. And then there's the fame part of it, which is totally bizarre. It's a thing that actually you don't have as a sense of self. You can't experience it. You may notice at a certain point that somebody knows you and you don't know who they are. And that means you've moved outside of your circle of familiarity, and then it can go farther and farther and farther and farther. But you can interpret that in a helpful way when you're in your studio trying to figure out what it is you're thinking, feeling, et cetera, et cetera. So, the question you asked, I don't have an answer for, but it's a complicated experiential question, that I think we all deal with. Now, if you go, what was that question again?
And I will say before you answer that I'm so glad that Norman Mailer wasn't also betting on Eric as well as Philip, because that could have been real disaster.
I remember, I think it was last week, that my son and I took a drive, and I always enjoy our talks. I mean, they're always, you know, we discuss various things, and they're always illuminating to me, and I get a lot of pleasure out of it. And I don't remember exactly what happened, but he pointed out to me that I was grateful a lot, that I had a capacity for gratitude. And I've been thinking about that ever since. And I think that, in a way, the world I grew up in, my father failed at one business after another. And we couldn't get out of my mother's house. And there was such a sense of failure that anything that came our way, anything that came my way, I was always felt a lot of gratitude for. And I felt that it was a kind of lighting a path forward. And when I perceived that, the school that I started has to do with helping people discover what they're really feeling. And it's usually a surprise because it's nothing like what they think they're feeling. When you start a poem or a story, you're really discovering that you think you're feeling this, and it's something very, very different. So in a way, they're getting to know themselves. They're getting to realize the hidden parts of themselves. And I think that my ability, that was my ladder, that was what rescued me. And I think a sense of gratitude every inch of the way forward was something that my most successful book is called Failure. Now, that's probably not ironical. That was the world I grew up in, and so if I've been able to come out of that, then I feel that being able to be grateful has something to do with it.
Thank you. It's a beautiful note to end on.
If I could say something just to Phil. Because I feel like such an asshole that the first thing I didn't say after you read your poem about my painting was, oh my God, wow, et cetera, was because I was speechless. And I'd read 2 drafts of it prior to that, so that wasn't a surprise. But the depth with which you capture and expand what I was trying to do and what the painting seems to hold, I'm sure it's every artist's dream, for one thing, to have that naming experience and to know that somebody has internalized, at that depth and with that eloquence and stuff like that, I just literally, I still don't actually know how to say wow with a gratitude and thank you attached to it, but it's deeply meaningful. So,